Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right in a relationship, giving love, giving attention, yet the more you give, the more distant they become? It's not because you're not enough, it's because you're playing the wrong game. See, when you're dealing with an avoidant, there's a specific fantasy they live in, and if you don't understand it, you'll keep chasing them and losing yourself. But if you do understand it, everything changes. Avoidants often present themselves as fiercely independent people. They value their space, their freedom, and their sense of control over their own life. On the surface, it looks like they don't need anyone, like they thrive on being alone. But here's the truth most people miss. Even avoidants want connection. They're not robots, they're not incapable of love. They crave closeness just like anyone else, but they carry a deep fear of losing themselves in the process. This is why they put up walls. It's not because they don't feel, it's because feeling too much makes them vulnerable, and vulnerability feels like danger to them. So when you step into their life with good intentions, wanting to love them, care for them, show up for them, you might think you're giving them exactly what they need, but in their mind, too much closeness too quickly feels like a threat, not a gift. The interesting thing is that this craving for independence is part of their identity. They pride themselves on it. They tell themselves stories like, I'm not like other people, I don't need anyone to feel whole, or I'm fine on my own. And the more life reinforces that narrative, the more they cling to it. Yet deep down, there's a different story playing quietly, a desire for someone who understands them without smothering them, someone who can share their world without trying to own it. This creates a tension inside them. One part wants love, the other part fears losing autonomy. That fear is what drives their behavior. When they sense too much pressure, they don't calmly explain what they need. They pull back, they go silent, they create distance. Not because they've stopped caring, but because that space helps them feel safe again. If you've ever been in this situation, you know how confusing it can be. One day they're affectionate, warm, even deeply connected. The next day they're cold, distracted, and hard to reach. You start wondering if you did something wrong, if maybe you're asking for too much. But that push and pull isn't about you being too much. It's about them managing their fear of being consumed. And the irony is, the more you chase in those moments, the more you try to close the gap, the more you activate their fear. They interpret your pursuit as pressure. Pressure feels like control, and control feels like losing themselves. That's why they retreat. So the first thing to understand is that the avoidance independence is not just a preference, it's a shield. It's their way of staying safe in a world where they believe closeness equals risk. They didn't wake up one day and decide to be this way. Often it comes from early experiences. Maybe they grew up in an environment where their needs weren't met, or where expressing emotions didn't feel safe. So they learned to rely on themselves. That self-reliance became their armor, and now, even as adults, they wear it everywhere. But under that armor, they still have the same longing everyone has, to feel seen, to feel understood, to feel loved without feeling trapped. When you understand this, you stop taking their distance personally. You start seeing that independence isn't a rejection of you. It's a survival mechanism they've carried for years. And until they feel like being with you doesn't threaten that sense of freedom, they will keep defaulting to space whenever things get too close. When you care about someone who leans avoidant, your natural instinct is to try harder when you feel them pulling away. You send more texts, you plan more dates, you try to reassure them that you're there for them no matter what. It comes from a good place. You just want to show love and keep the connection strong. But with an avoidant, that instinct can have the exact opposite effect of what you intend. The harder you push, the more they retreat. And it's not because they don't appreciate you or because they secretly want someone else. It's because every move you make that feels like pursuit triggers their fear of losing control. Avoidants value control because control equals safety for them. When they feel like they are choosing the relationship freely, they can stay calm. But the second they sense that control slipping, when your behavior suggests you need them more than they need you, or that you're trying to pull them closer than they're ready for, they feel trapped. That feeling of being trapped is what sends them into self-protection mode. They start to pull away, not because they stopped caring, but because they need to restore balance in their mind. They need to feel like they have the power to choose again. Imagine someone who has spent years telling themselves they will never depend on anyone. Suddenly they meet you and they start to feel something real. It feels good, but it also feels dangerous because if they allow themselves to rely on you, they lose some of the independence they've worked so hard to protect. So when you begin to close the gap by texting more, checking in, asking where they've been, they interpret it as you trying to control the pace. In their mind, it's no longer about what they want. It's about what you want from them. And that's terrifying because it feels like a slippery slope where their needs stop mattering. So they pull away to reclaim that sense of control. You might see this in subtle ways at first. They take longer to reply to your messages. They seem less enthusiastic about plans. They start using phrases like, "I've just been busy," or "I need some time to myself." It's not that they suddenly hate being with you, it's that they need space to feel like they still have autonomy. When you keep trying to close that gap, it creates pressure. That pressure feels like control, and control to an avoidant feels like losing their freedom. So the cycle begins. You chase, they retreat, you feel anxious and chase harder, they retreat even further. And the more you try to fix it, the more broken it feels. This dynamic can be exhausting because everything in you wants to bridge the distance. You care, so you keep showing up. You keep proving you're there. But with an avoidant, those efforts backfire because they misinterpret your consistency as demand. Even kindness and reassurance can feel suffocating if they're not ready for it. That's why the best thing you can do is understand that their pulling away isn't punishment, and it isn't a sign that you're failing. It's a reflex born from fear, not rejection. When they feel you pressing in, they see it as a threat to their independence, and that's the one thing they're determined to protect above everything else. Playing into an avoidance fantasy doesn't mean pretending to be someone you're not or manipulating them. It means understanding what makes them feel safe enough to stay close. At the core of that fantasy is freedom. They want to believe that being with you won't mean losing themselves. For an avoidant, love feels risky because they associate intimacy with being trapped. So when they think about a relationship, their worst fear is that they'll have to sacrifice their independence, their choices, their sense of self. That fear runs so deep that even small gestures can set it off. A text that expects an immediate reply, a comment that sounds like a demand, or too much time spent together without space. To them, those things aren't just signs of affection, they're warning signals that they're about to lose control of their life. When you play into their fantasy, you show them that connection doesn't have to cost them their autonomy. It's about giving them the space to breathe without making them feel like you're disappearing. It's about creating an energy where they feel drawn to you, not pressured by you. And the way you do that is by taking the focus off constant reassurance and putting it on creating lightness and choice in the relationship. When they feel like they can choose you freely, that's when they relax. When they feel like being with you doesn't mean giving up who they are, that's when they lean in. This is why matching their pace matters so much. If they pull back and you chase, they feel hunted. If they pull back and you also vanish, they feel abandoned. But if you allow space without punishment, you create a new experience for them. One where closeness doesn't equal pressure. That doesn't mean you have to pretend you're not interested. It means you hold your ground. You keep living your life, pursuing your goals, staying connected to your world, instead of making them the center of everything. That's attractive to an avoidant because it signals that you won't disappear into them. It tells them you're someone who values your own freedom as much as they value theirs. When they start to see that, the dynamic shifts. Suddenly being with you doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like an addition. They realize they can have intimacy without surrendering their individuality. And when they feel that, they start to let their guard down. The irony is, the more freedom they feel with you, the closer they want to be. But if you try to force that closeness before they're ready, they'll fight you every step of the way. So playing into their fantasy isn't about game playing. It's about alignment. It's about showing them through your behavior that you understand their need for space, and you're secure enough to give it without resentment. When you do that, you create trust, and trust is the one thing that makes an avoidant stay. They need to know that loving you won't cost them the most important thing they have, the ability to feel like themselves. That's the key to breaking the cycle of chase and retreat, because you stop being the person who threatens their independence and become the person who protects it. Creating emotional intrigue with an avoidant starts with understanding how they experience connection. When you chase, when you overinvest, when you make them the center of your world, there's no mystery left. Everything about you becomes predictable, and predictability feels heavy to someone who is afraid of being trapped. They don't want to feel like they know exactly where you are at all times, or that you're waiting by the phone for their next move. That kind of certainty removes the sense of choice they crave, because it tells them the relationship is on rails heading toward a destination they didn't agree to. And the more they sense that inevitability, the more they pull back. Matching their pace doesn't mean playing hard to get or pretending you don't care. It means responding to the energy they give you instead of trying to overcompensate. If they're taking things slow, you take things slow. If they need space, you let them have it without punishment or passive-aggressive behavior. This doesn't just help them feel safe, it also creates curiosity. When you don't react in the way they expect, it makes them pay attention. Most avoidants are used to people chasing them harder when they withdraw. They've learned that pulling back equals getting more effort from the other person. When you don't do that, when you stay calm and centered, it breaks their pattern. Suddenly they're wondering why you're not running after them. They start to question what makes you different, and that questioning pulls them toward you. Emotional intrigue comes from your ability to maintain your own life, your own priorities, your own sense of joy no matter what they do. When you're centered like that, you become magnetic because they realize you're with them by choice, not by need. And that choice makes them feel safe because it signals that you're not going to suffocate them with your dependence. They start to see you as someone who can share experiences with them without taking over their identity. That's incredibly powerful for someone who fears losing themselves in a relationship. Another way to create intrigue is by revealing yourself in layers instead of handing over everything all at once. Avoidants often keep walls up because they're afraid of being consumed emotionally. So when someone overshares too quickly or demands instant vulnerability, it feels overwhelming. When you let things unfold gradually, when you allow conversations and intimacy to develop over time, you give them room to process and stay engaged. They start looking forward to discovering more about you because you're not trying to unload everything onto them in one go. That slow reveal builds anticipation, and anticipation is what keeps them invested. The most important part of matching their pace is staying connected to your own boundaries. This isn't about tolerating bad behavior or pretending you're okay with being neglected. It's about not letting their rhythm dictate your entire emotional state. When you can stay steady and consistent without chasing, you send a powerful message. You're confident enough to let things breathe. You don't need constant validation to feel secure. And that energy is rare for an avoidant because most people in their life have tried to close the gap with pressure. When you do the opposite, when you allow space and fill that space with your own life, you create something that feels different, something that feels safe and exciting at the same time. That's what makes them lean in, not because they're being pushed, but because they want to. When someone is avoidant, they aren't looking for constant reassurance, even though it might seem that way from the outside. In fact, reassurance often has the opposite effect on them. When you over-reassure, when you keep reminding them that you're there, that you won't leave, that you love them, it starts to feel like pressure. They read it as expectation. They interpret it as a sign that you need something from them, and that makes them feel like they're losing control. The truth is, what draws them in is not someone who constantly proves their devotion, but someone who radiates security and self-worth without needing to prove anything at all. Security is attractive to an avoidant because it signals safety. When you're secure in yourself, you don't chase, you don't cling, and you don't make them responsible for your emotional well-being. You show up as someone who is whole on their own, and that is exactly what makes them feel like being with you won't come at the cost of their independence. Self-worth means you don't shrink yourself to fit into their world. You don't abandon your needs or your boundaries just to keep them comfortable. You're not afraid to say what matters to you, but you say it calmly, without desperation. That energy creates respect, and respect creates trust. And trust is the foundation an avoidant needs before they can let themselves get close. Imagine the difference between two scenarios. In one, you're constantly texting, trying to check in, needing to know where they stand. In the other, you're living your life, you're present when you're together, and you're warm without being overwhelming. Which one feels lighter? Which one feels safer? The second scenario is what makes an avoidant feel like they can breathe. They're drawn to the person who doesn't crumble when they take a step back, the person who doesn't spiral into anxiety every time there's space. That person feels stable, grounded, unshakable. And for someone whose greatest fear is being consumed, that stability is magnetic. Another piece of this is how you respond when things feel uncertain. If your sense of worth depends on their approval, you'll react with panic the moment they pull away. You'll try harder, you'll push more, and that only makes them retreat further. But if your self-worth is solid, you don't take that distance personally. You don't make it mean you're not enough. You recognize that it's about their fear, not your value. And because you're secure in that truth, you give them space without resentment. That doesn't mean you tolerate neglect or settle for crumbs. It means you're not reactive. You know what you deserve, and you hold to that without drama. That calm confidence tells them you're safe. It tells them you won't try to control them, and at the same time, you won't lose yourself in them. For an avoidant, that combination is irresistible. Someone who can love deeply without needing constant reassurance. Someone who can stay connected without clinging. Someone who brings peace instead of pressure. That's what makes them feel like being in a relationship doesn't mean losing freedom. That's what makes them feel like they can choose you without giving up who they are. And when you embody that energy, you stop triggering their fears and start creating the kind of connection they secretly want but don't believe is possible. The fantasy of an avoidant isn't built on constant closeness. It's built on the idea that closeness will never take away their personal freedom. At their core, they want to feel like they can be in a relationship without sacrificing the parts of themselves they value the most. That includes their space, their autonomy, their ability to choose when and how they give love. When they imagine their ideal partner, it's never someone who demands constant updates or needs reassurance at every turn. It's someone who feels like an addition to their life, not an obligation, someone who brings connection without creating weight. And that fantasy isn't just about the absence of pressure, it's about the presence of lightness. They want to feel energized in your company, not drained. They want laughter, curiosity, a sense of adventure, and above all, they want to feel like you could survive without them even if you choose not to. When you lean into this fantasy, you shift the dynamic entirely. Instead of making the relationship feel like a contract with rules and expectations, you make it feel like a choice that gets renewed every day. You do this by showing that you have a full life outside of them. That doesn't mean playing games or pretending you don't care. It means genuinely investing in your passions, your goals, and your own happiness. When they see that, they stop feeling like they're your only source of fulfillment. That's crucial because an avoidance fear isn't just about losing independence. It's about being consumed by someone else's needs. The moment they sense that you rely on them for your sense of self, they start to panic. But when they see that your identity is intact, that your joy doesn't hinge on their attention, you become the safe harbor they never thought they'd find. The other part of this fantasy is emotional depth without emotional chaos. Avoidants are not allergic to emotions. They're allergic to feeling overwhelmed by them. They want intimacy, but not the kind that feels heavy or dramatic. They want someone who can talk about feelings calmly without turning every conversation into an ultimatum or a crisis. When you can express what you need in a grounded way, without blame, without desperation, it makes them feel like they can stay. It reassures them that your connection won't come at the price of constant emotional firefighting. And that allows them to relax because they no longer see love as a threat. Another element that keeps this fantasy alive is unpredictability, not in the sense of chaos or games, but in the sense of freshness. When every interaction feels predictable, the relationship feels like a script. But when you can keep things interesting by trying new experiences, by sharing different parts of yourself over time, by bringing curiosity and playfulness, you give them something rare, excitement without pressure. That blend is intoxicating to someone who craves freedom, but also secretly craves connection. So leaning into their fantasy isn't about manipulation. It's about alignment. It's about creating a space where they feel both close and free, both connected and independent. And the beauty of this approach is that it doesn't just serve them, it serves you too. Because when you build a relationship on choice instead of fear, on trust instead of pressure, you're not just holding on to them. You're building something that lasts because it feels good for both people, not just one.